This is Professor Reha, Chief Information Officer of Clan Indigo Oni, here with another gaming news report. First off, I would like to apologize. I didn't do enough research on Amnesia Rebirth. If I had, I would have discovered that Amnesia Rebirth was confirmed to have custom stories back in March, and I just didn't find Amnesia the Dark Descent subreddit where that information was widely known. I should have checked a little bit more thoroughly. I didn't know it existed, and I didn't even think to look for it, in case it did. And so the fail is mine, and I apologize. This does give Amnesia Rebirth the kind of longevity it needs for everyone interested to see if long-term single-player horror games can outlast or at least maintain a similar kind of interest as multiplayer horror games. And that's really what we're talking about here, because if Amnesia Rebirth does not last long enough in terms of viewer interest and player interest, then the number of long-lasting horror games that are being financed by businesses and that content is being created for is going to decrease in favor of multiplayer horror, which will be seen as the bigger audience draw for those of you and I who create content. And for those looking to acquire money, the multiplayer horror will be the better investment of both time and money. So that's really what this conversation is about, and the potential ramifications in the long term. Does that mean we'll never get single-player horror games? No, that is not what that means. There will always be single-player horror games, as I stated in my last video, but there will just be an increased emphasis on such things as the multiplayer horror games and the longevity of those, rather than single-player games. So, with that being said, I want to, now that I've got that out of the way, I would like to talk very briefly about scalping and why it's so bad in 2020. And the short answer is quarantine. See, the problem here is that if you understand the basics of supply and demand, then you'll probably already know where I'm headed with this. But there is the alternative that you may not know what supply and demand is, and essentially, there are three ways in which products are priced. There are three factors that go into how much a product is priced for. The first is how much it costs to make. This includes both the costs of its materials and the costs to pay people to make that particular product. That's the first thing. The second is how much profit the company at least wants to make, roughly speaking. A sort of an arbitrary rough draft of a price. For example, for the PlayStation 5, there were rumors of a $500 price tag for a really long time, and that would have been what is known as the rough draft price, or what I'm calling the rough draft price. It was kind of the ballpark of where Sony was thinking of pricing it. But what actually finalizes the price is supply and demand. Essentially speaking, the more of something there is, the less cost it will be, the cheaper it will be, essentially. And the more something is demanded, the higher the price will be. A great example was when quarantine first was established, toilet paper was high in demand and low in supply because everyone wanted it. The demand was so high it outstripped the supply, and so there was a supply shortage, and people actually tried scalping toilet paper. I'm not even kidding. If you haven't heard of that, the attempts were made. But regardless of the attempt to scalp toilet paper, because people will try to scalp anything, that's essentially what we're talking about here with the NVIDIA 3080, the Xbox Series X, and the PlayStation 5. See, there's just not enough supply for the demand. Now, the economic conditions present because of quarantine is the primary reason why the supply was so badly underestimated. The companies who make these looked at the economy, looked at the unemployment rate, which has increased because of, again, quarantine, and they said to themselves, we don't think a whole lot of people, or at least the normal amount of people, is going to be interested in buying a gaming console when everyone's tightening their belts, etc. So they undershot the demand-supply equation. Great. But the reason why demand is higher than they anticipated is because there are a lot of people stressed because they're worried about their families, or they've lost their jobs, whatever. There's a variety of reasons why the quarantine would stress people, and as a result of that, they want something to distract them, and a big cool gaming console is the perfect way to do so. Now you're probably wondering, well, these people have potentially lost their jobs, or they're in economically interesting situations. How can they afford this? And the short answer is, since these units were all announced very far ahead of schedule, like we knew for a long time coming that these were coming out. People had already put aside at least some money to purchase these when they were released. So people had money set aside before quarantine that they already had the money there, and buying a system wasn't going to be that big of a problem. They had already planned ahead for that. And now more than ever, people really want stress relief. People really want something to distract them away from the problems of their lives. And games are a great way to do that. Especially if the game can also communicate a great story that you can really get invested with as well. Which, incidentally, is part of the reason why people were so up in arms about The Last of Us 2, is partially because there were just so many people who had nothing else to do that they all just kind of dogpiled on that. But anyways, now that that fun fact is in there, I mean, obviously there were other reasons, but it's the reason why the response was so extreme for The Last of Us 2. But that's also the same kind of motivating reason why demand for the consoles and for the 3080 is so much higher than what the companies themselves anticipated. It's something that will help keep their mind, or take their mind away from the troubles of quarantine, at least for a little bit. So that's why scalping is so prevalent here. It's a combination of a shorter than desired supply because of quarantine, and a higher than normal demand, again because of quarantine. And that's really why scalpers are kind of going gung-ho in 2020. Now, something else that quarantine has affected is indie gaming. You may have noticed that the number of indie companies are kind of slowly going out of business. For example, Lab Zero went out last week, and they created the game Indivisible. Whether or not you've heard of it, it was for an indie game, very popular game, and the company has now gone under. There will no longer be support for this game, but it's not the game itself that matters here. It's the fact that game studios like Lab Zero are starting to go under, and they're being replaced by indie games developed by actual individuals. Think Five Nights at Freddy's or Phasmophobia, both of which were developed by individuals. In Phasmophobia's case, that was created because there's now more time with people losing their jobs and being out of work and not being able to find a new job because of quarantine. These are people with free time, and one of the things that some of these people are doing is making games because they've always wanted to, and now they have the time to, while they are unemployed and looking for a new job. They're making games. Or mods. Or, in the case of some people, they're hacking multiplayer games, which is why you've been seeing so many more headlines of various gaming companies cracking down on the hacking. Hacking has always been present in multiplayer games for as long as computers, I guess, have existed, roughly speaking. But it's particularly bad in COVID because all of these people who wouldn't normally be hacking now have all this free time to do so if they've lost their job. If they're one of the unfortunate people who lost their jobs, now they have the free time to figure out how to hack multiplayer games. So the amount of hacking that exists currently online today is higher than it would normally be. And as a result, gaming companies now have to crack down even harder on it because of the increased amount of hacking going on. But they are responding pretty strongly for the most part. Tracking down hackers and banning them and getting rid of them on a long-term or permanent basis is difficult. It's not particularly easy, especially if they're using a VPN, but it is possible, and they have been working towards it, even if you don't necessarily always see the results. So that's also another fairly interesting aspect of quarantine that people are aware of. The modding scene, of course, has been flourishing because, again, there's more people with more time. But beyond that, that's really a majority of the news that I wanted to cover in this episode. I would like to point out two other things. No, just one other thing. One of those was kind of political, and I don't particularly want to get into politics because I'm not really a huge fan of today's politicians. Either side. I'm politically neutral. But the one piece of news then I will cover, which has nothing to do with politics, is the fact that Minecraft has gotten an update that allows people in multiplayer to ban individual people's messages in chat. Which is great because if you're a parent with a child who plays Minecraft and you've been concerned about people potentially harassing your child online through Minecraft servers, well, now your child can ban their they'll prevent themselves from seeing that person's comments, which is fantastic. It doesn't prevent griefing, which is another problem on Minecraft servers, but it does at least prevent conversation with potentially unpleasant or unsavory people in Minecraft. So if you've been concerned about potential online interaction for your child on Minecraft, there is this new ability to mute individuals on a multiplayer Minecraft server. Now, obviously, the child still has to be old enough to understand how to do so and the significance of this, but I think a majority of Minecraft's audience are in that age range of at least knowing why and how to mute people. So that's a fairly good positive bit of news in terms of Minecraft specifically, which is this is a really great time as well with all of these children at home doing their schoolwork at home and, you know, having a bit more free time than they normally would because they don't actually have to travel to and from school anymore. That's all really for gaming news for this particular episode. Thank you all very much for joining me, and if you have any questions or things you would like me to cover in a very specific way, please leave a comment down below. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If not, ignore me. And thank you all very much. Have a great 24 hours.